Thank you for your interest in Missouri's Special Education State Performance Plan and Annual Performance Report process. This is the complete list of SPP indicators. This presentation will cover Indicator 4 on discipline removal rates. Indicator 4 has two parts. The first part, A, includes all students with disabilities and examines whether students with disabilities are removed for discipline purposes more often than non-disabled students. The second part, B, is similar but looks at removal rates for students with disabilities by race and ethnicity and adds on a compliance check to see if the discrepancy was related to noncompliance. An important thing to note about Indicator 4 is that it is focused on the number of districts with discrepancies in discipline removal rates and not the number or percent of students who were removed from their usual classroom or school. At the end of every school year, districts are required to report every in-school or out-of-school suspension or expulsion that was a half day or more. From that information, we calculate discipline removal rates for students with disabilities and non-disabled students in order to determine if there were discrepancies between the rates. As you can see, there's a lot going on related to discipline and behavior. First, we publicly report on the number and rate of discipline removals. That public spotlight can lead to better discipline practices in districts. We also use discipline data as a risk factor when identifying focus areas for districts during their compliance monitoring reviews, and high discipline rates could result in a district receiving an on-site monitoring review. Some of the project work in professional development directly addresses promoting positive behavior and therefore reducing discipline incidents. Others are indirectly linked to behavior. By making sure that students are learning to read and being engaged in a quality education, students will be more engaged in school and less likely to receive suspensions. Also, this work helps the adults in the school systems adjust policies and practices to ensure that the educational system is there to support all students. You can request additional information on any of these by sending an email to the address at the end of this presentation. This shows how we define a significant discrepancy for Indicator 4. First, we're only looking at long-term out-of-school removals, and long-term means more than 10 days. We then compare the removal rate for students with disabilities to the removal rate for non-disabled students in the same district. If students with disabilities are suspended or expelled 4 times more often than non-disabled students for 2 years in a row, and the district had at least 10 removals for students with disabilities, we consider that district to have a significant discrepancy in their rate of removal for students with disabilities. Any district that meets this criteria then goes through a review process to examine their policies, procedures, and practices, and they are required to develop a plan for improvement. As you'll see next, very few districts meet this criteria for a couple of reasons. First is that there aren't a large number of districts that have at least 10 long-term out-of-school removals for students with disabilities. For those that do, if their removal rate is 4 times higher than the rate for non-disabled students for 1 year, we let them know, and that often provides incentive to lower their removal rates without going through the review process. As shown on the previous slide, we also use the discipline data in other ways that may encourage alternatives to out-of-school removals. This chart shows historical data for Indicator 4A, which again is looking at the removal rate for all students with disabilities compared to the removal rates for non-disabled students in a district. The blue bars show the percent of districts that had a significant discrepancy, meaning that the rate of removal for students with disabilities was significantly higher than the rate of removal for non-disabled students for 2 years in a row. The actual number of districts was 2 each for 2019, 2020, and 2021. The reason the percentages for these years range from about 4.5% to 6% is that the number of districts that had enough long-term out-of-school removals to include in the analysis ranged from only 33 to 43. Those are pretty small numbers out of all the school districts in the state. Said differently, Missouri doesn't have all that many districts with more than 10 long-term removals for students with disabilities, and of those, only a couple have significantly higher rates of removal for students with disabilities than non-disabled students. The targets that we need to set are based on the percent of districts. 2017 is considered our baseline year for this indicator, and therefore our final target year has to be lower than the baseline year percent. Because we have a small number of districts that have enough removals to even consider in this analysis, we are proposing to set the rest of the target years at about 6%. There's a link to a feedback survey at the end of this presentation. The survey will ask you if you think the proposed targets are acceptable or if they should be set higher or lower. Indicator 4B is similar to 4A but with two main differences. First, 4B looks at the removal rates for students with disabilities by race and ethnicity. For example, we compare the rate of removal for Black students with disabilities to the rate of removal for non-disabled students. Second, if a district meets the criteria for significant discrepancy for a racial or ethnic group, the same review process happens as with 4A, but what we report for 4B is whether or not there was identified noncompliance with the requirements relating to development and implementation of IEPs, the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports, and procedural safeguards. This chart shows that over the past 5 years, we've had between 30 and 40 districts with enough long-term out-of-school removals to be included in the analysis. And of those, 2 to 4 districts were identified as having significant discrepancies in their rates of removals. Through the discipline review process, no noncompliance was identified. However, the districts are still required to develop and implement an improvement plan. Because 4B focuses on whether there is noncompliance, the targets must be 0%, so we are not asking for your feedback on targets for this part. The feedback survey asks important questions about improvement activities. Please help us identify what's working, what's not working, and what we can do to help improve results for students with disabilities so that the state and local school districts can meet the targets we are setting for the future. We need your feedback. Click on the SurveyMonkey link or use the QR code to go directly to the survey. Or you will find these indicator recordings and feedback surveys on the SPP APR Stakeholder Information webpage. Questions about this process should be emailed to speddata@desi.mo.gov. Thank you so much for your time and participation.